by the people living in metro cities. So I think
it's just past 5 p.m. across India. I am Tanvi Taneja. Live from New Delhi, you're watching DD India Global. We'll bring you the day's big stories from across India and the world. Joining me from London is my colleague, Ollie Barrett. Good afternoon, Ollie.
Hello there, Tanvi. It's 11:30 a.m. here in London, 12:30 p.m. across Central Europe. Coming up in the next half an hour, the latest on the chances of a new Gaza ceasefire, doctors on strike again in England, and major protests in Argentina. First, the headlines.
Egypt seeks to broker Gaza ceasefire as Hamas and Israel both assert demands. UNSC vote on Gaza aid delayed again as US works intensely on ceasefire and release of more Israeli hostages. Russia splashes $12 billion to keep their aviation sector afloat since Western sanctions over Moscow's military operation of Ukraine cut off supplies of key parts and maintenance. US, South Korea and Japan urge North Korea to engage in dialogue without preconditions after Pyongyang's surprise ballistic missile launch. Kim warns of nuclear attack if provoked with nukes. And Argentina's newly elected president, Javier Milei, pushes austerity plan with over 300 economic deregulation measures despite protests. Getting you the latest on the Israel-Hamas conflict, the Israeli army has released a video showing weapons in a school complex in Gaza. The IDF said its soldiers enabled the evacuation of civilian population from the school complex. The IDF also added its fighter jet struck a compound in Khan Yunis, killing Hamas terrorists living there. As Israeli troops continue their operations in Gaza, the army has discovered a network of tunnels running deep beneath central Gaza. As per the military, the tunnels were found by soldiers registered under the name of a senior Hamas leader. Accessed by spiral staircases and an elevator up to 20 meters below the ground, the tunnels were facilitated with electricity, plumbing, surveillance cameras and heavy blast doors.
As the Israeli army was operating in the area of Hamas leaders in the heart of Gaza City, where the political and military leadership of Hamas is situated, we uncovered an area that served as a base for terror that were located in civilian buildings. With the operation of ground forces and based on intelligence we received under the area of leadership, we uncovered a branch network of strategic underground bases.
Meanwhile, top Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh continues to be in Cairo as Egypt tries to broker a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. This was a rare trip abroad made by Haniyeh, who resides in Qatar. Intensive talks are being held on a truce to allow additional aid to reach Gaza and free more hostages. In November, 110 of 240 hostages held by Hamas were released in exchange for Palestinian prisoners during a temporary truce. There's been another delay in a Security Council vote of the United Nations for a humanitarian pause in Gaza. This latest delay comes at the request of the United States of America, which says it needs more time to consult. DD India's Jody Jacobs reports from the United Nations in New York.
It's been delay after delay. The initial vote on this current legally binding Security Council resolution was first scheduled for Monday, postponed to Tuesday, delayed to Wednesday, and now once again rescheduled. On Wednesday, the Council held close consultations to continue the negotiations, and these were followed by the announcement of yet another postponement to Thursday. Diplomats here in New York say there's growing frustration with the United States' repeated requests for delays, A major sticking point in this new text is the question of whether the United Nations should take over from Israel to inspect humanitarian shipments going into Gaza, something which the organization ordinarily does in other countries. Israel, we are told, wants the United States to reject this, as it would effectively leave it with no role in screening the shipments. But the UAE's ambassador to the UN, Lana Nasabeh, whose country tabled the resolution, told reporters on Wednesday they've been working long hours and believes giving it another go for additional diplomacy could yield positive results. She says she remains optimistic an agreement will be reached. Earlier this month, the US vetoed a similar Security Council resolution backed by almost all other council members. And while the intense political negotiations continue, the head of the UN's Children's Fund, UNICEF, has warned on Wednesday that there's barely a drop of safe water to drink in Gaza. Jody Jacobs at the United Nations, reporting for DD India.
On to Britain now. Junior doctors in England are in the middle of their three-day strike to demand better pay from government as the health service grapples with one of its toughest winters on record there. Ollie Barrett is in London. He gives us more on this and other stories making headlines around the world. Ollie, hospitals really feeling the pressure now with the junior doctors going on strike?
They very much are, Tanvi, what is, as you say, always one of the toughest times of the year for the National Health Service in this country. Junior doctor members of the British Medical Association are now into day 2 of their 72-hour walkout in hospitals across England in what is a long-running and at times bitter dispute over pay. The British Medical Association, which represents around 50,000 junior doctors, says its members will also walk out again for 6 days from January the 3rd to 9th of next year. The doctors are seeking a 35% pay improvement, which they say is necessary to cover the impact of inflation going back several years. The government says its offer of an additional 3% on top of the 8% pay rise already received by junior doctors is reasonable, and the government insists the 35% demands are not realistic or affordable. Germany will provide an additional funding round of $96.89 million to Ukraine to help strengthen its energy system as Russia continues to target Ukrainian infrastructure. The German Ministry for the Economy will contribute $59.4 million via the state-owned bank, and the Foreign Ministry will contribute $37.4 million to the Ukraine Energy Support Fund. Russia has handed out over $12 billion in state subsidies and loans to prevent its civil aviation sector from collapsing due to Western sanctions. Major Western plane makers Airbus and Boeing halted supplies and maintenance support to Russian airlines back in March 2022. To support the sector, Russia had to dip into its reserve funds. Russian airlines currently operate 991 planes, partly by importing spare parts via third countries without manufacturers' permission. DD India's Dasha Chernyshova reports from Moscow.
According to the estimates of the Western media, Russia has spent over $12 billion in state subsidies and loans to keep its aviation sector afloat over the past 2 years. Since the start of Russia's so-called special military operation in Ukraine, aviation sector has faced severe sanctions targeting major Russian airlines and their executives. Boeing and Airbus suspended the delivery of spare parts to Russia and halted maintenance and support. So as in many other areas, Russia had to develop its aviation industry alone with domestically sourced parts. Anna Panina, director for the Aviation Industry Department at the Ministry of Industry and Trade, said earlier this year that between 2024 and 2026, Russia will spend around $1.2 billion on aircraft manufacturing and financial assistance for airlines. She said the goal is to increase the share of aircraft and helicopters produced in Russia in the fleet of the largest carriers by 2030. Earlier this year, Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin Mishustin announced new solutions to support the domestic aircraft industry, including easing the rules of granting subsidies from the federal budget. Dasha Cherneshova, reporting in Moscow for DD India.
Ukraine's air defense has shot down 34 out of 35 Russian drones launched in a major overnight attack on 12 Ukrainian regions. Russia launched Iranian-made Shahed drones in several waves, and the air alerts in the center, southeast and north Ukrainian regions lasted for hours. There were no immediate reports of major damage or any casualties. Next to Argentina, where the new libertarian president Javier Milei has signed an economic reform decree lifting export limits and easing regulations to address the country's severe economic crisis. Milei, who's been in office for less than 2 weeks, has pledged to curb inflation, but has warned that economic shock treatment is the only solution. Latin America's third biggest economy is struggling after decades of debt and financial mismanagement, with annual inflation at 140%. And thousands in Buenos Aires have been protesting against the government's economic shock measures in a first real test for the new libertarian president. Amid a major police presence, the protesters, led by groups that represent the unemployed, made their way to the main Plaza de Mayo Square, an historic meeting point in front of the presidential palace, to demand greater financial support for the poor. Top diplomats from the United States, South Korea and Japan have condemned North Korea's ballistic missile launches of recent times. In a joint statement, the three countries urged Pyongyang to engage in substantive dialogue without preconditions. Meanwhile, North Korean leader Kim Jongun has said that Pyongyang will not hesitate with a nuclear attack if it senses an enemy provocation with nuclear weapons. Kim made the remarks as he met with soldiers under the military's Missile Bureau over its recent launching drill of an intercontinental ballistic missile. Kim said that Monday's missile launch demonstrated the military's high mobility and rapid attack capabilities. South Korea and Japan have resumed high-level economic talks for the first time since 2016, in a sign of improving ties amid shared geopolitical concerns. The talks, which first began in 1999, had been stalled since 2016, as relations between the two nations soured over disputes stemming from Japan's occupation of Korea for 45 years. Japan is protesting a ruling by a South Korean court that holds 2 Japanese companies accountable for forced labor during World War II. It comes as deputy finance ministers from the two countries hold talks on boosting economic cooperation. It's a meeting considered by experts to indicate those swiftly warming ties. DD India's Chris Gilbert has more from Tokyo.
This court ruling could develop into a complete spanner in the works for the rapidly warming ties between South Korea and Japan. Over the last 9 months, the two leaders of the two countries have managed to put historical grievances behind them, which had been simmering tensions between South Korea and Japan, particularly over the last few years, and really clear a path forward to work together and with the United States on areas of common interest. But now these historical grievances have come right back to the surface with the Supreme Court ruling. It refers back to rulings by other courts in 2018 in South Korea, which called on Mitsubishi Heavy and Nippon Steel to compensate the victims, survivors and families of those who were subjected to forced labor by those companies and other Japanese institutions at a time when Japan ruled the Korean Peninsula from 1910 to 1945. It focuses on forced or at least free labor without any compensation. Nippon Steel and Mitsubishi Heavy, after rulings in 2018, effectively said that they are not going to compensate survivors or their families, believing that this was already solved in an agreement in 1965. And earlier this year in March, we saw the South Korean government a year into Yoon Suk-yeol's presidency say, look, we are just going to compensate them ourselves. It's going to come from the South Korean coffers. And since then, we have seen the path clear for the warming of ties that have subsequently developed between Japan and South Korea. So now this court ruling throws all that back into question. Japan has protested the ruling. Yoshimasa Hayashi, the new chief cabinet secretary, absolutely blasting it, saying it's totally unacceptable and a clear violation of the Japan-South Korea claims agreement. So again, harking back to previous agreements that have already been made to protest court rulings, but questions remain about what the future holds and if this is going to fray, yet again, ties between the two countries. Chris Gilbert in Tokyo reporting for DD India.
Venezuela has freed 10 US citizens as part of a prisoner swap with the United States. It's the largest ever prisoner swap between the two governments. DD India correspondent Mary Trinamania has more details.
The White House confirmed the release of 10 U.S. citizens, 6 of them designated as wrongfully detained by the State Department. The swap took place in a third country. Before leaving Venezuela, all of the prisoners went through a medical examination. Among the Americans released, 2 former members of the U.S. Special Forces, Aaron Berry and Luke Denman, who were sentenced to 20 years in jail after participating in a failed attempt to overthrow President Nicolás Maduro. This swap comes after the U.S. eased oil sanctions on Venezuela in October. It's the result of many months of secret talks between Venezuelan and U.S. officials. The White House says this is a positive step forward. The current negotiations aim to secure competitive and democratic presidential elections in Venezuela in 2024. Returning to Venezuela is Colombian businessman Alex Saab, who was arrested in 2020 and accused of money laundering. Saab was facing criminal prosecution in a Florida court. Caracas celebrated the return of Saab to Venezuelan soil, saying he was kidnapped by the U.S. On Wednesday, he was welcomed by President Maduro at Venezuela's presidential palace. The Venezuelan government also freed about 24 individuals, some of them linked to the opposition. In Caracas, Mary Trinamania reporting for DD India.
And from London, time now to hand back to New Delhi in the studio there. Tanvi.
Thank you very much, Ollie. Ollie Barrett joining us from London. You're watching DD India Global, still to come on the show. Taiwan accuses China of economic coercion after Beijing announced the removal of tariff cuts on 12 chemical imports from the island. And a coastal city in eastern China turns white from record-breaking snowfall.
India that invents. India that innovates. India that excites. India that invites. Land of possibility. Teeming with opportunities. Watch India Ideas each Thursday, 8 p.m. only on DD India.
Welcome back. You're watching DD India Global. I am Tanvi Taneja. On to Asia now. Taiwan has accused China of economic coercion after Beijing announced the removal of tariff cuts on 12 chemical imports from the island. The tensions come ahead of Taiwan's presidential and parliamentary elections that will be held early next year. China claims sovereignty over the island nation. Beijing has accused Taipei of violating a 2010 trade deal by imposing discriminatory prohibitions and restrictions on Chinese exports. China's foreign ministry said that China hopes that the Philippines will work properly with the country to manage the situation in the South China Sea. The comments came after its foreign minister told the Philippines to address, through dialogue, serious difficulties in their relations over the South China Sea. China lays claim to most of the waters within a so-called 9-dash line, which is also contested by Brunei, Malaysia, Taiwan and Vietnam.
China's position on maritime disputes with neighboring countries has always been clear and unchanged. We hope that the Philippines will make rational decisions and follow the effective way of getting along with neighbors and work with China to properly handle and manage the current maritime situation.
Moving eastwards to the Oceania region, pursuant to the $1 million relief assistance announced for the Pacific country, India has sent relief supplies to Papua New Guinea on a special charter flight. Relief supplies, including approximately 11 tons of disaster relief material and 6 tons of medical aid, took off for the volcanic eruption-affected people of Papua New Guinea. And back to New Delhi. Lower House of Indian Parliament, or Lok Sabha, was adjourned sine die on Thursday. On the last day of the winter session, India's Information and Broadcasting Minister Anurag Singh Thakur moved the Press and Registration of Periodicals Bill 2023 for consideration and passage. The bill was passed in the lower house through voice vote. Replying to the discussion on the bill, the minister said that the new law will take us out of the mindset of slavery.
पिछले 10 वर्षों में पुराने संसद भवन हो या नया संसद भवन, इनमें गुलामी की मानसिकता से बाहर निकलकर नए भारत के लिए नए कानून बनाने का जो शानदार काम हुआ है, सबसे पहले तो मैं प्रधानमंत्री मोदी जी को उसके लिए धन्यवाद देना चाहता हूं और आभार प्रकट करना चाहता हूं सभी माननीय सांसदों का। उसी दिशा में आज मैं भी आप सबके सामने प्रेस एंड रजिस्ट्रेशन ऑफ पीरियोडिकल्स बिल 2023 को लेकर आया हूं। ये बिल भी गुलामी की मानसिकता से बाहर निकलकर नए भारत के लिए एक नया कानून लाने का कार्य हमने किया है।
In the upper house of Indian Parliament, India's Home Minister Amit Shah moved the 3 revised criminal laws for consideration and passage. These bills, the Bharatiya Nyay Second Sanghita 2023, the Bharatiya Nagrik Suraksha Sanghita 2023 and the Bharatiya Sakshya Second Bill 2023 were passed by Lok Sabha on December 20th, 2023. The 3 bills replace the Indian Penal Code of 1860, Code of Criminal Procedure of 1973 and Indian Evidence Act of 1872. Now, speaking on the death penalty to 8 former Indian Navy personnel in Qatar, the Indian Ministry of External Affairs in its weekly media briefing today said that the case in the West Asian country's Court of Appeal is on.
This case is now in the Court of Appeal, as it's called. And there have been 3 hearings in the Qatar Court of Appeal. November 23rd, November 30th and December 7th. Meanwhile, our ambassador in Doha got consular access, mentioned that last time we met, to meet all the 8 men on December 3rd.
More from India. India's campaign Viksit Bharat Sankalp Yatra is being undertaken across India with the aim to attain saturation of government's flagship schemes by ensuring the benefits of these schemes reach all targeted beneficiaries in a time-bound manner. In this series, the Viksit Bharat Sankalp Yatra reached Ritti Panchayat of Udhampur district in the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir. Villagers listened to the Prime Minister's message and took on the spot benefits of various government schemes started for their welfare. And now we take a look at what else is happening around the world. Serbia's opposition supporters protested in Belgrade for the 3rd consecutive day after the election, which according to them, the ruling party won due to fraud. Opposition leader Miroslav Aleksic said that their lawyers had requested the annulment of the elections on December 17th at all levels. The Democratic Republic of Congo voted on the 2nd day of a chaotic general election after authorities extended the opening hours for polling stations that failed to open the previous day. The elections across Africa's 2nd largest country were disrupted on Wednesday by delays in delivering election kits and malfunctioning equipment. And China's eastern Shandong province brought a record snowfall after days of severe snowstorm, blanketing large swathes of land in white. The unusually frigid weather, ushered in by a powerful wave of cold air from Siberia, has spread across China since the middle of last week. And that's all in this edition of DD India Global. Do join us for another edition of the show at 7:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time. You can connect with us on Facebook, X and Instagram at DD India Live. We will be back with more news as it breaks here on DD India. I am Tanvi Taneja from my entire team in New Delhi. Thank you for watching. Namaskar.